Welcome to Pondering the Orb in the special edition of the show examining New EDGE SWORD SORCERY Magazine #1. I'm your host, the wandering fantasy author Jay Reckward, and I'm honored to call myself a sword and sorcery author. I first started writing in the genre because of my love of Conan, Elric, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, Ziriel, and so many more who burned their stories into the fabric of who I am as a storyteller. However, when I first started in sword and sorcery, there were few outlets readily known to champion the genre, and truth be told, many relegated this cornerstone of fantasy to something old, of a time no longer fitting with the modern day. Despite this, many wonderful authors continued to publish novels and short story collections that were read by a dedicated fanbase who knew that this genre's best days had yet to dawn. Enter New EDGE SWORD and Sorcery Magazine. Offering a refreshed look while honoring the work of its forebears, the sword has been rehoned, the armor polished, and once again, adventurers are ready to take the quest. Given the passion of what lies in this first issue, I have no doubt that this genre will find victory. Before we begin, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Let's start the journey. Collecting the spoils of a successful raid into the lands of their enemies, Gunjar and his fellow warriors of the Takanda capture a slave bearing a mysterious torque around her neck and scars dug into her skin like worms burrowing the flesh. Eager to go home and be celebrated, they bring the weird titanium with them. But have they brought along a prize, or their doom? Flies buzz from the slave's mouth as a grim curse takes hold. New EDGE SWORD and Sorcery Magazine #1 opens with a sword and sorcery horror by Kirk A. Johnson, a Trinidad-born author living in the same place as I, the wondrous city of New York. The writer of Obenax and other tales of heroes and horror, a collection of short fiction inspired by his love of sword and sorcery flavored with his study of West Africa and the Sahel, he is also the founder of the independent publishing house Farfield Press. Let's read from his story, entitled Carnivora. Carnivora by Kirk A. Johnson. "The strong swallows the weak," Gunjar shouted, "and I'm a strong son of a..." He was known to sing the Eater song from a Takanda war hymn into the night sky, and would have continued if not for the lone star outshining the others. Even in the season when both sister moons, Koi and Ki, were absent from the heavens, the night's star-filled beauty would still enthrall him with its wonder. It was in these moments that the laughter of his warriors and howling of bookie wolves in the distance became as silent as flashing glowflies or spirits playing in the wind. But this was an unusual sight. "And whose god are you?" he smirked, strolling over to a nearby shrub to undo his loincloth before pissing into the thicket. "If you are a god, then bless me for this privilege." After, he joined the encampment, commanding 4 of his more alert warriors to guard their cattle before taking his seat by the campfire. Under his command, 12 warriors had captured 30 Nadamas, calves, cows, and bulls, and marched 6 days through rival domains without dispute. There was no doubt that this would secure his place in the Takanda hierarchy. It had been a short road for him from warrior to Gayindi, lion hero, proving his worth with the most successful raids and fame in clan wars. And he would be the youngest Gayindi to make high chief, younger than even his great-grandfather before him. Though a mighty warrior, the current high chief, Gumball, could not see beyond tomorrow. But Gunjar could. He had grand plans for his people's future, plans to overshadow his forefathers. The tales of rival clans growing in size and wealth, if true, would prove to be a vexing problem. Soon, he knew the Takanda would have to again go to war. Even though the Takanda always came out the victor, he wondered how long it would last without more sustainable means of survival. He meditated. Trade alliances and treaties would make an enterprising addition to our wealth in Adamas. Our territories would expand. Our prestige would grow even higher than... A twig snapped. All his senses jumped into focus as he grabbed his spear and zeroed in on an open patch of shrubbery. With his spear raised, he readied its oryx horn tip to thrust into whatever came out. He held his breath, ready to impel leopard or rushing tusk boar. Instead, Kelly, one of his younger warriors, bumbled out of the thick vegetation with a bright smile, pulling a woman with hair braided neatly to her scalp. Kelly shoved his captor to Gunger's feet and announced, "Look what I found." He tugged at the leather strap binding her neck and wrist and tossed it to Gunger. The Gyendi caught the leash and inspected the captive, tapping his spear against her thick thighs as her rounded cheeks peeked from underneath her loincloth. Her brown eyes and round nose made her an alluring beauty, if not for the flies buzzing around the woman's full lips. A gold nose ring hung between her nostrils, while an ivory ring, marked with strange carvings, encircled her neck. Gunger noticed the grotesque marks of her torque also marred her back and shoulders, which had healed to look like broad, coiling black worms. A chill brushed up his spine as he noticed the knight go silent, but her crooked back and bent neck eased whatever concern he thought he felt. "Spare me, High Chief," she begged, falling on her hands and knees. "I can be of great use to you." Her head bobbed, tapping a dent in the dirt. "I have been a slave for the Gasandara for too long. I am no High Chief. I am a Gyendi of the Takanda." Gunger's spear butt pinned her head to the dirt. "You must have been a prize captive," Gunger mocked, shooing the flies furiously close to his face. "Why run from one master to be bound by another? I am of the Debal." She turned her face to avoid speaking into the dirt. "Those lesser men from across the river are unworthy of me." Gunger walked around the bronze woman, inspecting her scars and bruises. She reeked of meat rot. "You speak well for a slave. I am Titanium, and I know of the Takanda. Both the living and the dead tremble at their name." By this time, the rest of his warriors surrounded the woman. Fasa and Bula, Gunger's seconds, kicked her while others jammed their spear butts into their ribs. A few whispered spells towards her scarred back, invoking protection from the madness that had disfigured her. Then they mocked her, establishing the pecking order for their gift from the wildlands. They would now enter their village with Gajula cattle, wares, trinkets, and a Debal slave for the High Chief. "Have her pull our litter," Gunger commanded. "Let her carry our packs. No one takes her. She is to go to the High Chief. We give her as she was taken." Gunger lightly thumbed the point of his spearhead as Titanium sat quietly by the campfire, with only the sound of cracking flames and flies filling the night. Morning washed over Gunger, calming him the further he marched into Takanda territory. He easily found the signs of previous Takanda passings, so the journey turned into a relaxing stroll through the grass. By midday, he gave his warriors a brief break and allowed himself to recline along the trunk of a lone boab tree. In the shade, he daydreamed about his two wives, Ananti and Inari, his 3 sons, and the wealth he'd held in oxen and goats, as well as position in the clan. As the tension melted away, he immediately fell into a dreaming nap. He dreamed the sky was blacker than night, as red lightning cracked the air with thunderclaps. The muffled sounds of chewing meat and cracking bones filled the silence between each clap as a chill ran through his chest. Someone moaned, and a vision of wriggling maggots flashed white against the sudden flash of a now blood-red sky. He gasped awake, throwing himself out of the shade and into the light of the afternoon sun. Gunger wiped the cold sweat from his brow. It seemed to him no one heard his cry. His warriors were too far away, and the Debal tended her litter. He immediately roused his men to move on. Gunger watched for hidden predators with the same alert tension that lingered from his dream. But the land was bare. The usual gazelles and gnus who grazed in the distance were absent. Not a monkey in a tree or a bird in the sky. Not even a leopard following the carnivore's song. He looked back at the Debal, pulling the warriors' stolen trinkets on their makeshift litter. Titanium's muscles rolled under the labor, stretching and flexing as if she were born for more than labor. She occasionally stood erect to gain better leverage, revealing herself to be taller than he first thought, almost as tall as himself. At dusk they found a small hillock and set camp at its peak. They built a cattle pen with branches cut from the random brush and bramble, and, afterward, freely lounged about the campsite, knowing by midday tomorrow they would be in their village. Gunger posted 2 men to watch over the cattle before joining his warriors and gifting them with 2 jars of Gajula brush wine he had taken in the raid. Those who sat by the fire had already begun to sing, and the eater's song melted through Gunjar's heart with the warm dreams of home, causing him to forget his midday nightmare. Visions of his village danced behind heavy eyelids as he envisioned celebrating with his soon-to-be predecessor chief, his wives, and his children, with honor once again covering his name. Gunjar sat by the campfire, while his men shared the bush wine, and Titanium curled up beside her litter, drinking water. The warriors had provided her only with an old woven blanket to keep warm. "Debal," Ahil called. "Tell us of the Gasandera. Do the men still weave baskets and buy their slaves?" "No, tell us about the Garida, further east. I hear they have cattle as large as rhinos," Kelly laughed, "with great bulbous horns and 2 humps. Titanium sat by the fire as flies buzzed about. "I have seen their bulls. The Kurinandamas are truly gifted animals. Once they slaughtered 3 for a feast to celebrate my master and his Garida bride. It fed the whole clan, including their guests and their slaves." Bao tossed a pebble at Titanium's head. "She lies better than you, Jibril." "It's true. I've tasted it," Titanium beamed. The meat fell off the bone, like rain. Jibril lightly tapped her head with his club as Mabao threw another pebble at her. Gunjar silently watched the broad-shouldered Fasa squat directly in front of Titanium, blocking the light with his muscled torso. Though he was the shortest warrior in the band, Fasa's ferocity and curiosity were well respected. "Tell me, I've heard tales of the growing influence of the Garida." Fasa ignored the flies. "The Gasandar and the Kuf in the far northeast have joined them. Is this true? Before I escaped, I saw much trading between them and the Garida. Shining crystals, green and red stones exchanged hands for copper, gold, and silver. They brought another metal, as sharp and strong as flint. They called it bronze," said the slave, and she glanced over her right shoulder, then left. "I've also seen magic from the craftsmen. The air was thick with its smoke. I fear they have offended the gods and ancestors. So I ran." "Magic and smoke," Fasa growled. "Lies and fables." Fasa pushed Titanium to the ground, kicking her until she ran off to her litter. This brought the warriors to howl with laughter and dry heave in hysteria, causing them to eventually bully each other. A small brawl broke out, which Gunjar chose not to indulge in. Instead, he stalked off to his unrolled sleeping blanket to ponder Titanium's story. Soon, the exhausted warriors stretched out on their backs and surrendered to sleep's tranquil embrace. Between midnight and dawn, Kelly awakened Fasa and Bula to take the last watch. They checked on the sleeping cattle, inspecting the perimeter for the spoor of lurking predators. Fasa, finding nothing amiss, sat with Bula by a campfire away from the warriors and the slave. As Bula added more kindling to the fire, a soft chant slowly drifted through the darkness like a whisper. Fasa strained to listen while dried grass rustled in the wind, and flies glided haphazardly into Bula's ears. The flame, once warm and alive, stopped its flicker. The world seemed suspended in tranquil stillness, refusing to breathe. Though their eyes moved, their lips could not. They could still feel the rapid thumping of their hearts, the quickening of blood through their veins. Flies crawled across their eyelids, ears, lips. The air grew cold. Sweat dripped over them like sap from a tree. Bula heard the grass crunch underneath someone's step, growing louder, closer. In the morning, Gunjar swept the dirt from his head and loincloth before making his way to the makeshift cattle enclosure. He called out to the sentries. No one answered, but embers still smoked from the campsite. "Damn them," he grimly thought. "Rise!" he roared, charging to the warriors and beating the men awake. "Rise, damn you! Bula and Fasa are missing. Find them!" Grabbing spears and shields, the warriors immediately began their search. They checked the pen in the nearby hills, through both tall grasses and brush. "The Nadamas are all here," Kodu reported. "Wake the slave!" They found Titanium hiding by her litter with her tattered blanket pulled over her head. The litter's contents were untouched. Gunjar snatched Titanium by her blanket and threw her out into the open. "What did you see?" He snatched her up by her torque. "Damn you, speak!" Grasping, she clawed at his wrist. "They came in the night. They came as shadows out of the bush. They took them back into the darkness. That's all I saw." "Who did?" pressed one of the warriors. The sweat made her neck slippery as Gunjar's knuckles pressed against her throat. "Demons," she choked. "In the night, they came." Gunjar pressed his stone axe against her throat. "What demons?" "The tall spear," she gagged, trembling. We turn to another story featured in New EDGE SWORD Sorcery #1, a tale by another author who has caught my eye long before this episode, but is no surprise to see her featured in this issue among so many other great authors. Bryn Hammond is the author of the Gallant series, a historical fiction that follows closely the secret history of the Mongols, a 13th century telling of the life of Chinggis Khan. Located in Australia, her work has also appeared in Ergot, Green Splotches, and as of now, New EDGE SWORD Sorcery Magazine. She brings us a tale of Goatskin Duzmat and their partner, the spear-wielding Chi Mao, who embark on a perilous quest for the truth against spirits, politics, and deeply seated magic in the land of Tangut. Funny, quirky, and action-packed, this is one for the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser fans out there with a wonderful queer romance at its center. Let's read from Sister Chaos by Bryn Hammond in the pages of New EDGE SWORD Sorcery #1. Sister Chaos by Bryn Hammond. Disemboweled by a spear called Pear and Flower, this woman enthralls our reign of peace and harmony. Sister Chaos. Perversely, the king of the Scarlet Jacket Bandits had become a cult among the scholar gentry, such that they circulated poems upon her in the polite tea-houses of the capital, Irikhaya. Often poems that questioned themselves as to why a bloody ex-peasant bandit held persons of their erudition, elegant manners, and attainments under an unhealthy spell of fascination. Goatskin Duzmat, too, knew the disadvantages of popularity, although her tale was told in street entertainments, not in salons, by actors who were as low in rank as she. Nevertheless, whose comedy sketches, where she flouted authorities or petty gods, amused the respectable classes in towns like Fatambit or Karakoto. Fame was already a problem for both of them when the Scarlet Jacket's king enormously exacerbated hers by the murder of an eminent scholar on the road. She killed him in his coach with her spear, Pear and Flower, and left a pressed pear flower pinned to the body's lapel as their signature to claim the deed. "I am led from a boast to another boast, from a feat to another feat," Angaj Duzmat lilted into the wind. Grass blue, flickering light on every side to the horizon. A line from a song. It has a melancholy air. It is the compliment of a hero who has to keep up his reputation or outdo himself in an escalation of challenges until he meets the thing that is too much for him. Do you not find, Goose, that a legend gratifies, yet also feels like unto a hound upon your heels? They were walking by remote ways to escape pursuit, Angaj Duzmet, known as Goatskin for her outfits, stitched hide with the hair on, the daily wear of her goat nomad people, but rough and wild to settle folk, and the bandit king who collected names like trophies. Foe and friend called her Chi Mao, that in hand meant marvel. In the bandits' marshes she enjoyed the title of the Wild Goose Utsu, for gangs in that sanctuary went by waterbird aliases, and every leader, a dozen or 2 dozen, was an Utsu in mockery of the one and only Utsu on his throne in the royal city of Halakar. Sister Chaos had caught on as her latest. These reflections, does he, after my highest profile kill? An arm curled around her cherished spear, which she had never relinquished to their camel. I can go higher. They snared each other's eyes. Chi Mao's gleamed in a certain way that always started up in Angaj Duzmat's head, a child's rhyme on the king of the dead. Urla Khan, like a black coal, thy countenance glitters. Down slid her scarlet jacket. Common hemp sewn over with a miscellany of silk swatches, a bird's tail of velvet ribbons, embroidered badges of office, not her own. Angaj Duzmat removed a coat that had only grown more shaggy as it grew attached to her in tail. To give up these garments in the interest of going unrecognized had been a suggestion repulsed by both of them. Chi Mao squirmed off her short red boots with tapestry cuffs of griffins, and Gaz Duzmat towed away her soft grip acrobat shoes. They wriggled out of leggings. This was another prophet of the vast grass, where 3 things in sight were upright. 2 soon nestled in the stalks like grouse, which left their camel drifting after the special grassy scent of his beloved salt seed. A while later, Chimao's post-orgasm gale of laughter was interrupted by the camel's bawl. They lifted their heads above the grass to see his skinny rear end at the sun. Between his two humps, their baggage. Why didn't we hobble the camel? He's always waited patiently before. What scared him? Grass waved aside to reveal a single antelope, goat-sized, bulbous-nosed. Its cover gone, it turned tail. I'll have that for dinner, vowed Chimao, and seized her spear. Naked, she took off in the animal's wake. Left behind, Angaz-Duzmut frowned. The bulb-nose had ventured strangely close. An odd attraction to their juice's scent, the way bears pursue women in the red. Further, she'd seen its fur in rags and tatters, like a felt doll falling apart from teeth or age. Molt of winter pelt ought to have been over months ago. Likely Chimao's dinner was diseased. She gathered her pieces of kit, an eye on her stark naked love skimming swiftly through the tall tufts and tassels. Antelopes were swifter. Chimao hated to lose a boast, to forfeit a target, or fail at a vow. Even if she had to run to the horizon, as their camels seemed to be doing in a different direction. Lucky Chimao kept her spear on hand, and Angaz-Duzmut wore her utility belt, her knife and sword. Other than that, they had their clothes. Angaz-Duzmut picked up Chimao's as well. Away in waist-high grass, Chimao cast her spear. Unfortunately at a distance, yet Angaz-Duzmut managed to admire the arc of her torso, the tightening in the shift, her shoulders' acute slide into angles, and the sight she did not often see, the bunch and swell of her spear arms' pair tattoos. Then her lover yowled, not a whoop to celebrate a hit. Grass lapped over her like a sea. Duzmut only distinguished her submerged head, her inch-short black hair in the seedy green. She pelted towards the spot, blades out. Chimao climbed to her feet again to meet her, scowling at her own right arm. That wasn't an antelope. Her right arm, her spear arm with its tattoos of pear fruit and flowers, seemed to be mildewed, the split pear half spotty, white petals crimped with black, a fungus on the twigs and glossy leaves. Anything else? Angaz-Duzmut asked her. No, that little antelope did this. It fixed its eyes on me, and they weren't animal eyes. They threw a blast at me, a blight. Lips peeled from her teeth as she examined her tattoos. Besides, she muttered and marched to where her spear lay harmless in the grass. I didn't miss. There wasn't too much to do but walk on the track of their camel. They expected he'd forget his fright and soon be feeding his face in salt sea bliss, or following the scent of water at a well. A few wells were found in the desert steppe of the Alishan, dug by nomads who lived there illegally. Jacket slung from her shoulders, and her semi-armor vest of leather with quartz knobs, Chimao glanced often at her injury. This better be a temporary curse. Chimao was vain of her tattoos. The right one went with the left one. Where her left arm straightened to guide her spear, the tattoo in the right arm straightened perfectly, but at the joint of her shoulder and the point beyond her wrist, while the right arm's ripe fruit, flower clusters and great leaves curled around the coil of her muscles. As for Duzmut, she might name Goose's arms the body part that most entranced her. She didn't want them spoilt either. Bulb-nosed antelopes have been driven out of Tangut, she mentioned. They had come across no spoor. The Alishan was their last bastion, but they're rare here too. Another victim of the sprawl of cities in the great state white and high. The herds trekked north to the high steppe, where only nomads are, and didn't return. One day I'll go myself. I bet it was the ghost of Scholar Shishu set on vengeance. Angaz-Duzmut swung her head to her, a bit astonished. Scholar Shishu? I hid you in the Alishan because scholar gentry never enter here, alive or dead. It's like a piece of the northern waste slap bang in the Tangut. Fit for animals and animal people, not perfected men. Not the only real humans. He had a big nose. The scholar did? The scholar did? Engaz considered. And our antelope's ragged coat? What did that signify? His reverend age, or his humility, his service in my less than prestigious home circuit. Its waters soothed his rheumatism. A backwater far from the capital gave him the quietude to write a treatise on the chastity of the classical style, with infrequent visits to the courthouse where a peasant's head or limb could be condemned to the chop at a quarter hour, with an interval for tea. Maybe, but their bulb nose was a scrappy animal to embody an imminent ghost. How about we ask the locals, proposed Engaz. Ghosts occurred to Chimao because of the ghosts of Quaidam. In the bandits' marsh, its dead bandit's ghost enforced an oath. Fugitive may do no harm to fugitive within the sanctuary. They kept the Quaidam peace, an underworld echo of the reign of peace and harmony over the rest of the state. If locals know this thing, we didn't bring it with us, and it isn't the avenging ghost of your last kill. Fair. After a few strides, she suddenly hollered in the air. Your net doesn't stretch into the Alishan. You are thinly stretched, you network of government men, you intellectual elite. Hang on, you're talking to it? If it is Scholar Shishu's ghost, I'll make him tell us. And she went on to flight him, to test his ghost presence with insults. Engaz stood back and shook her head. There's a mob of peasants for every one of you. And guess what? We have culture, too. Ours is not the dead hand of ancient scripts and thousand-year-old virtues. You do not study. You stultify. You brick yourselves up in your classic texts, the same esteemed texts that teach the same minds to think the same thoughts through the centuries. And they march out to our villages, an administrative army of examined scholars, doctors of philosophy on deployment. They have the works of civilization at their fingertips. It is the invasion by the sect of literati. With a punch in the air, her feet off the ground, she screamed, "Fuck the classics!" At the end of this performance, Sister Chaos waited for a response. The scholar did not strike. Perhaps it isn't him. The grass beside her split. Yes, their antelope, the height of an ugly goat. Grass stalks swished violently as it took its floppy, flabby nose, a sprout for its two nostrils. In rut, a stag shakes his head to boast how big his nose is. He even inflates the organ and cheats a bit. Squelch of swollen tissue, a clicky sound of cartilage, that much was mating song. But Engaz heard a huff and a wheeze that wasn't normal for the species, and she got the distinct impression it was laughing. A shuffling nose laugh, its beetle eyes stuck out knobs of bones squeezed half shut, like a laugh squint. Chimao staggered and wrapped her arms across her eyes. Next second, an explosion hit Engaz, an explosion of sensory input that wasn't hers. Light and noise and chaos, until her brain began to sort the vision. Then she was. A wild spirit tearing through the halls of a palace, blasting left and right at gorgeously uniformed soldiers. In her wake burst soldiers, as if a firecracker had gone off inside of them. Bloody halls, and her own wild shriek above the human clamor. Abruptly the vision ceased. Engaz reoriented to her physical eyes, and saw Chimao stooped and blinking. No sign of the antelope. It's gone. Chimao straightened, unsteady on her legs. Tell me you saw that too. Attack on a palace? Yes. A memory, I think. Didn't the palace look old to you? Out of history? Tang Imperial uniform, underneath the blood. Tang ended 300 years ago. Slowing down the flash of vision, Engaz saw the end of her own muzzle. A wrinkled muzzle that belonged to the antelope type, trembling with the noise it was emitting. Bulb noses are timid animals, little and skittery, but in the sex months of the year the stags stretch out their nostrils like a trunk and try to trumpet as loud as an elephant. Engaz might have thought the slaughter left and right its fantasy, if the spirit hadn't sent a blast at Chimao's spear arm. It isn't your scholar, ghost. Little freak, complained Chimao, still clutching her head. All right, let's go ask the locals. Sword and sorcery not only birthed the literary movement, but continued to inspire art and aesthetic across the cultural spectrum that highlights bravery, vitality, and a liberated spirit. And of course, Pondering the Orb celebrates these motifs found in melodic death metal, and once again, we have found a band. Hailing from Toulouse, France, Aephanemer is a symphonic melodic death metal band with 3 powerful anthemic albums, bursting with the themes of fantasy, bravery, and philosophy, all crucial ingredients to engrossing sword and sorcery. Taken from their album 2016's Memento Mori, this is Oathsworn by Aephanemer. Located in the borough of Queens, New York, Imrryr is an experimental post-rock and ambient band that built their sound and aesthetic around one of the timeless authors of the sword and sorcery genre, Michael Moorcock, who returns to the scene with a new Elric tale in the pages of New EDGE Sword and Sorcery #1, entitled The Folk of the Forest. And like any Elric tale, Imrryr captures the weirdness, the atmosphere, and the grandeur of Melobene in their wonderful music. This track is taken from their 2022 release, The Dreaming City 3, based on the stories of Michael Moorcock. This is The Dreaming City by Imrryr. Our final segment is an interview with the editor of New EDGE Sword and Sorcery Magazine, Oliver Brakenbury. Oliver was kind enough to sit down with me and discuss the motivations behind this magazine, working with Michael Moorcock, and of course we dished for a good long time about how much we love this genre. Please enjoy. So, Oliver, thank you so much for joining me on Pondering the Orb. And of course, we're here to discuss New EDGE Sword and Sorcery, issues 1 and 2, the magazine, of course, that you created and you're the editor of. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks, man. It's fun to join you, and I really enjoyed our off mic chat, so I'm already in a good mood. Now it
Excellent.
should be on mic.
Yeah. Um, so, sword and sorcery is a very special genre, I think not only to us professionally, but also personally. Um, where was the moment, if you can reach back before you were an author, before you were an editor, before you were a podcaster, stretch back in your memory? Where as a reader did sword and sorcery find you? And do you remember the story, the characters?
I wish I could remember the precise story. I can remember the first thing I read ever. It was an issue of Batman, but and actually we were going to stay in the realm of comics for my sword and sorcery introduction. I can't tell you the
Perfect.
precise story, but I can tell you it absolutely was Savage Sword of Conan, the big magazine format, black and white, and like Ernie Chan and all those other really great artists. And yeah, I they seized me by the throat. I was so intrigued by them. And I still think of them fondly now. I've got a few issues I picked up over the years of recollecting it. I should really get the omnibuses, but well. And yeah, I really, really loved them. I think they stood out from all the other fantasy I was checking out as a kid
Mm-hmm.
in a number of ways. I mean, one thing I really liked, even as a kid, and only more so as I get older, is how Conan is a remarkable guy, but he is ultimately just a guy. He is not
Mm-hmm.
a chosen one. He is not, a member of some superhuman race, or he has, he's not like I dig superheroes, but he's not that. He's just a remarkable person whose God doesn't care about him,
Right.
and who has a kind of sort of he has a code, but he's not like a straight up good guy. So you don't always know what he's gonna do, right? It can be interesting, and there's that mix of, as people like to say, who are fans of him, his melancholy and his mirth. Like there's a range of tone to the stories
Mm-hmm.
that overall averages out to, generally speaking, fun adventure, but sometimes weird, dark horror. There just was so much to get out of it that I really loved. And this thing of him being, again, like a very capable man, but still just a man, um, occasionally facing things that were just completely cosmic and strange, and even he was frightened of. I always really dug that. He was fearless against other people, but he too would feel a way, and maybe I would feel if I saw like a strange thing from outer space or whatever. I'd be a little freaked out by that. And sometimes he fought it, sometimes he ran, and you're like, yeah, I get it. I could relate more to him. And because he felt more grounded, albeit a remarkable grounded, it made the fantastic elements, which tended, I found, to be more unique. I mean, sometimes you just get a giant snake, but overall, it tends to be something a little more wild
Mm-hmm.
than Tolkien-esque. It's an elf, it's a dwarf, whatever. And so, by making the fantastic more fantastic and unique, and by making the protagonist more grounded, I found that the two elements, would strike stronger sparks. And
Mm-hmm.
it is certainly in my imagination as a young reader. It didn't hurt that there was violence and some, nudity.
Right.
But I mean, these are things that bring vitality to life. Why not in our fiction? And yeah, it was absolutely Savage Sword of Conan, absolutely. And I feel bad saying this, but I should admit, I years after I loved Savage Sword, but I read it regularly. I did kind of fall off of fantasy in general. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
why. I was one of those, early high school, middle school kids who just got it in their head you had to choose teams between science fiction and fantasy.
Right.
For whatever reasons, I can't recall my logic. I chose sci-fi, and I just fell off fantasy for a long time. Plus, a lot of more contemporary fantasy kind of, I don't know, it wasn't for me. But 7 years ago, I began volunteering at a massive archive of SFF, and I was like, hey, those Savage Sword of Coneheads, I don't think I've ever read the original Robert E. Howard's. That's terrible. I gotta fix this. And so, at that archive, I got the Lancer Conans because I was curious. And I heard about those, when their place in the whole history of the genre.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I just started reading all the Conan, and then I read all the Elric and all the Fafhrigir Mouser and all the Jarell and all the Amaro, well, most of the Amaro, and
You
so
were
on and so
hooked.
forth. I still got to finish that guy. But yeah, you get the point, right? So like, I just got sucked hard back into the genre, and then next thing you know, I'm publishing a magazine.
That's
So yeah.
That's fantastic. I have to ask you, and this is kind of an aside question, but and we'll probably have several of those in this interview. But when you read Howard today, what do you think is so appealing about him for modern readers? Because he's been around since the late 30s. He's constantly had a resurgence. It seems every decade or every other decade. But Conan the Barbarian is so vital to some of our understanding when it comes to the fantasy genre. What do you think is so appealing about Robert E. Howard as a writer?
Ooh. Well, yeah, I think like the word I see thrown around a lot is like vitality in his writing. And like, well,
Mm-hmm.
what does vitality mean? Well, it means that like his descriptions just have, oh gosh, when you're reading things, you can tell he's really putting his back into it. There's a real energy to it. The story is always moving quickly forward, whether or not any individual scene, there's a rhythm, right? I mean, some scenes are quieter,
Mm-hmm.
some scenes are faster, some scenes are action, some scenes are chatting. But whatever's happening, he's almost got like um I don't want to say a filmic way of writing because he
Yes.
wrote before movies really influenced writing heavily for his
Mm-hmm.
writing. And yeah, but it's like he's got a great sense of pacing, a great sense of forward action, and this is appealing, and because he wrote primarily in the short story format, it's also very easy to sort of sample him. And if you don't like one story, maybe you go to another one, you check that out. He also famously was great for draping sword and sorcery like a cloak over other genres. So you get a lot greater sense of maybe variety within his sword and sorcery that you would from other sword and sorcery authors over the years, right? Like God in the Bowl was a locked
Mm-hmm.
room mystery that happened to have a big weird giant snake thing and sword and a sword.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Gosh, I'm still waking up a little bit. Sorry, folks. Black River.
Oh yeah.
Beyond the Black River.
Beyond the Black River. Yeah.
That's basically like a Western frontier kind of story, but and so on and so forth, right? Like he was writing at a time when genre was less codified, perhaps than
Right.
it is today, or certainly has been since maybe I would say the early '80s. And so I think you benefit also just from the era he was writing in, bringing that kind of flexibility. And there is a kind of like philosophizing to his writing. I think there's a reason we're all still talking about Conan, and we're not all still talking or wherever really we're talking about a lot of the ripoffs of Conan that would come later,
Mm-hmm.
clonans, people sometimes refer to them. And
Right.
I think it's because as much as there are very surface pleasures in Robert E. Howard's writing, the sword striking the guy's head off, the giant, monster, the attractive woman or whatever, there is a kind of like cowboy philosophizing underneath
Yes.
Conan that's very enjoyable. I often think of the speech he gives in Queen of the Black Coast, where he talks about, if life be an illusion, then so be it. I'm going to live it just as hard as I can, no matter what. And that's my terrible summarizing of it. It reads much better.
No, but that's it. That's
But yeah,
absolutely
it's
it.
a
Yeah.
it's a great answer to the whole, somebody gets a little too high and they're like, what if it's a simulation? Kind of question. And I
Well,
just
you
think, it's that thing of like, command, embrace life, embrace life. However you do it, whether you're Conan doing it by having adventures or whether you're just, I don't know, seizing that job opportunity you're scared to go for, or you're asking out that person you're into that, you're nervous they'll say no. I think there's that feeling of just go for it, just go for it, man, in his
uh,
writing that I really love. I said about like 9 things, but hopefully that gives you an idea.
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to comment real quick on a point you made about his draping on other genres. And you mentioned Queen of the Black Coast, which is one of my favorite Conan tales. That's a tragic romance. Like,
Yeah.
sure, there's a murderous, monstrous creature flying through the air. There's pirates, they're reaving the Black Coast. But like at the core of it, it's a romance between Conan and Belit. And
Yeah.
I think you nail it so well about him being at the time being able to drape something that he was created over multiple genres and then forge what we're talking about today. Um, of course, your love and passion for sword and sorcery ultimately led you to take up the charge for it, resulting in this wonderful magazine its current readers have been eagerly anticipating since the debut of issue number 0, which is, of course, currently free on the New Edge Sword and Sorcery website. I've been in the position to help start a publisher, and there's always risk. But those that decide to get into this do so because they see something is needed for them to do on the literary scene and in the literary space. What was the need you saw in the sword and sorcery genre that led to the creation of New Edge Sword and Sorcery?
Well, it came out of conversations with other people who had been there longer than me, and been, I don't want to ever give the impression that I feel like I'm the savior of the genre, and I, on
Of
my own,
course.
riding in on my white horse, will fix everything. But obviously, as you say, I had to have some kind of motivation to throw myself into this. It's certainly not a get rich quick scheme. Uh,
No, not at all.
um, so yeah, basically what I got out of interacting online with the sword and sorcery scene, primarily on the Whetstone magazine Discord. Shout out to
Hmm.
Whetstone Amateur Sword and Sorcery magazine. I
Ooh,
strongly recommend people check it out. It's free
wonderful
and it's
publication. Yeah.
yeah, and it's very much a good, great place for people who are um, on the newer, end of the spectrum with their writing to get a chance. I really recommend it. Anyway, they have a lovely Discord where I was just hanging. It was the watering hole, and I learned very quickly, as with all scenes, there are some cyclical conversations that come up over and over, and they tend to have a lot of passion and then burn out, and then they'll come around again in a few months, and nothing much will have changed. And I could see with Sword and Sorcery for a while there had been this feeling of, okay, it's been laying fallow since the bubble kind of burst on the second wave of popularity in the early to mid 80s.
Hmm.
How do we, fan the flames again? How do we get a third wave of popularity? How do we get more people reading this thing, man? You know, and as we were having, I was seeing that conversation come around again, and I was like, okay, I think this is maybe one of those cyclical conversations, but how can we maybe break the cycle a little bit and like get some forward momentum? And I can't take credit for the idea that kicked it off. Howard Andrew Jones, an excellent author
Yes.
who I strongly recommend. I've interviewed in my podcast.
Chronicles of
Actually,
Hammond,
exactly,
fantastic
exactly.
book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, he's doing some very interesting stuff over with Maine and also with his publication of his own magazine, Tales from the Magician's Skull. Absolutely
Hmm.
a big inspiration for what I've been doing. Um, he in the 2000s had a similar idea in the sense he coined the term New Age sword and sorcery,
Hmm.
and somewhere in the mid 2000s, I forget the exact year, sorry. And the basic idea, as he manifested it, was look, we know that this genre was birthed in the 30s and had a second wave in kind of the 70s, 60s, 70s. And that means that like sometimes when you direct people to the classics, they might trip over old attitudes, sometimes kind of offensive things about race or about women, as you do when you look at literature from any genre going back far
Correct.
enough, or even in the present sometimes. And so his feeling was, okay, well, let's try and like, new edge coming from the idea of like knocking the gilt and dirt off of a like gilt
Yeah.
off of a sword, sharpening it, honing that thing, and just keeping what makes it great and keeping it moving forward. So like let's try and make a concerted effort to be more conscientious about how we write new sword and sorcery, how we basically show our love for the classics through our expression of new things, and not because like sometimes when you want to really riff on something you love, if you're not careful, you're not maybe thinking hard enough about what is in it, and you might replicate aspects of it that are not great. And I think that sometimes happens. It's not, sometimes when I pitch this to people, they kind of think, oh, you mean just like straight up racism? And like, I don't really mean people using the N word in their in their new SNS stories. I just mean like not thinking hard enough about how like the word savage maybe gets used or how
Hmm.
women are treated in their stories because not because they are like
Absolutely.
bad people, the authors, but because they're just replicating what they loved, what was written in an older era. So this, as I understand it, was Howard's take. Was like, let's just knock off the dirt, sharpen this thing, let's go forward, and charge. But alas, I think it maybe was a little too soon. I think in the 2000s there was still this hangover of people remembering like a lot of really bad, usually like Italian-made,
Hmm.
riff-offs of the Conan movie, which itself is great. And just in
Yes.
general, like the sort of the bust of the 80s was still casting a long shadow. So I gather it didn't quite light a fire yet. But fast forward to early, gosh, I guess it's 2021 now, when
Yes.
this conversation's happening on Whetstone. And Howard's like, well, and he kind of reminded some people and educated a lot of people, including myself, about the whole concept of New Age sword and sorcery. And we were all like, holy crap, that's great. Okay. Talked about it in more detail, tried to flesh it out. There it got wild. There was a whole like writing a manifesto, the kind of madness. But eventually it gets to this place where Scott Oden, another great current working
Hmm.
author, I recommend people check out, he
Grimnir.
bless him kind of just like nudged me because I sort of I guess I was being very the guy really talking, and also I'm an organizer. I've worked in film
Hmm.
and TV, and so I always think of like, okay, well, how do I get a bunch of people to make a thing and do a thing, and I'm always organizing. And so I kind of I guess became a louder voice in that conversation. And Scott was like, you should probably make something. People need
Right.
to hold something. They need to have like an example of these values or whatever being put into motion. You can't just have you're gonna have a website and people read it and then so I was like, yeah, okay. And a lot of people were saying do an anthology, but I myself had been fantasizing about doing some kind of magazine for a couple of years. And
Hmm.
I just hadn't had what felt like strong enough focus to do it yet. I don't like to do a project just because I want to do the format. I need to have a exciting enough, content, as it were.
Right.
And this felt like it. And so when Scott prodded me, I was like, ooh, maybe, and then I asked Howard, and with his blessing, I used the name New Edge Sword and Sorcery. And I had way too much writing about what it was, and then I boiled it down to like a tweet. But this is when tweets had just been doubled to 240 characters, so it's still a little long. We do have, if anyone wants to read this, or condensed but longer idea of what the magazine's ethos is, you can see that in the header graphic on our website. But then when it got down to the point of me trying to craft like a 30-second ad to go on someone's podcast, I was like, okay, that's way too long. And so I got to this, which I will say here for you. Our tagline for the magazine and its whole sort of ethos is made with love for the classics and an inclusive, boundary pushing approach to storytelling. And it's kind of all there, right? And you see our logo, it's a two-faced battle axe looking back and forward. Because a lot of times people get it in their head, oh, you want to like do the new, does that mean you want to burn down the old? Hell no. I've got my Lancer Conans, I've got some Savage Swords, I've got all that other stuff, I've got on my shelf. But I also want to see you know, the audience of Sword and Sorcery, which is predominantly this.
Yeah.
White
Right.
straight fellows, 35 and up, nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to get rid of any of them.
Yeah.
I want them, I want more, but I want more of
Here we are.
everybody.
Yeah.
Like, how do you expand? Yeah, some of my best friends, but how do you expand the scene, right? You got to go outward, and you got
Right.
to, make it more perhaps welcoming. And I think even if you're not being openly hostile, if a scene is composed largely of a similar demographic, it can sometimes make other people think, they'll look over and go, oh, I guess that's not for me. And I want to be like, no, it is. As I want to have a wider variety of people writing, reading, and just generally being fans of sword and sorcery. And I also want to try and make inroads into the greater, science fiction fantasy reading scene, where, because the SNS lay fallow as long as it did, there's the sort of other issues, the other need that I saw to address, the sort of the diversity and growth, bringing more young people, bringing more diverse people. But there's also the dilution of the term sword and sorcery. If you go to a lot of people, including people you think would know better, right? You think, oh, well, they know the history of publishing, of SFF and stuff. But, I do mean broadly. I'm trying not to be like the, I'm actually, guy here about,
Of
I'm sure I don't
course.
want to be pedantic. I don't want to be a gatekeeper, but sword and sorcery is a distinct fantasy subgenre with its own unique flavor that is worth defining somewhat, because when you define it, you have a rich new vein to tap into, as opposed to just swirling it in with everything else, like mixing 10 ice cream flavors together and getting kind of a slurry. uh,
Right.
I want to try and reach out to the greater SFF scene and be like, hey, everybody, how sword and sorcery maybe to you is just like a synonym for fantasy, and you think maybe, oh, well, yeah, Lord of the Rings, wizards and shit, just everything. Actually, it's this cool specific flavor that, by being specific with it, you can do all kinds of amazing stuff within its boundaries. I think it is such a flexible genre. Again, going back to draping it like a cloak over other things. I'm most fond of all the definitions you'll see online, and I've joked that arguing over the definition of SNS is SNS, because you see so much of it. But I would say my favorite definition is Brian Murphy's, and you'll encounter it in
Yes.
Flame and Crimson: A History of Sword and Sorcery. It's a great book. You can find it on
Fantastic
Amazon,
book.
all
We
that stuff.
covered it on Pondering the Orb. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. So, okay, so you've talked about it here. I won't go on about it in
Yeah.
detail, but yeah, my one of my favorite definition is in there, and one of the reasons is because he lists 7 things that you're very likely to run into in sword and sorcery, but he doesn't say you have to have all 7. He doesn't say how many is the minimum. He just says, look, here are things you're going to run into. The more you sort of put in the soup, the more SNS it'll probably feel, and
Right.
that's up to you, the author and the reader, to like figure out for yourself. There, and that's, yeah. So I just want to be like, hey, check it out. And here it's flexible. It's got these aspects, and that whole thing I was talking about earlier with why Conan really grabbed me is really why SNS in general really grabs me. Of the more grounded elements and the more weird and unique, fantastic elements, just knocking off each other so beautifully. I'm talking all over the show. This is what
No,
happens when you're very passionate. I saw a need
this
for
is
more young
fantastic.
readers, more diverse readers and authors, and growth, obviously, and trying to encourage people who aren't already in the choir to care about SNS being distinct, and to care about its future and as well as its past, which is why we have nonfiction in the magazine, right? We have our stories, of course, 7 or 8 stories per issue on average, but in our nonfiction, we have essays, which tend to be something about like the general genre and its possibilities going forward, and something else more about, like a profile of someone important to his history, issue 0, which you can download for free
Yeah.
or get at cost POD off Amazon. It's very cheap. It's like $4, $5 for the soft cover, and like 12 for the hardcover. It's in hardcover, folks. By the way, not everybody does that with magazines. I thought this would be a cool format. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's issue
it's
0 for you.
wonderful.
It'll last a long time. If you're someone who really loves the book as object, I recommend this. And of course, we did hardcover for issues 1 and 2 and improved it, because with traditional printing as opposed to POD, we were able to do things like put like a ribbon bookmark in with a specific color taken from the cover art, so it all matches together. Anyway, yeah,
No,
yeah. I think I just like yeah. I'll cut myself off, man, because I know you
no,
want to keep this tight.
never apologize for passion. You said so many things. I actually teared up on this end a little bit. I got into
Yeah.
this at 19, and I didn't start publishing until I was like 24. And I've been trying to push Sword and Sorcery and publish Sword and Sorcery and like get my career as a Sword and Sorcery author going for such a long time. And you mentioned so many things that I have been seeing throughout my entire publishing career. Like, it really does need to find a younger audience again. It really does need to rejuvenate itself. It really does need to appeal to, a not necessarily a modern view, but it needs to be able to approach it. And at the same time, like, there's so many wonderful things that Sword and Sorcery has done to help define the fantasy genre that it really does need to be known that, hey, these are unique things that came from this. And without these, you don't have this kind of vital thing that we think of as fantasy. You kind of touched on my third question. Can you elaborate on what the new EDGE Sword and Sorcery movement is? So I have a couple follow-up questions kind of built around that. Brian Murphy's book, Flame and Crimson, really is wonderful because it does, kind of lay out this idea that you only need these kind of ingredients, but it's a soup. You don't need to have all of them. You can make it kind of to your taste. I heard an argument long ago from the former editor at Pyre, Hugo Award-winning Lou Anders, that Sword and Sorcery kind of works on the same plane as epic fantasy, but they're scalable. Do you think that epic fantasy is something unique to itself, and something completely different from Sword and Sorcery? Or do you think that there is kind of a commingling? Because I think in modern fantasy, especially, there's a lot of, especially in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of like stuff that is marketed at epic fantasy, but if you read it, the story's told in this kind of like really broken down, kind of concentrated way where you're just focusing on character, which is really the big kind of focus of Sword and Sorcery, character. Do you think that there is a bridge between the two, or do you think that they're uniquely different things to themselves?
I mean, I think it kind of blends, hearing you say that, I'm thinking a lot about Joe Abercrombie's, breakout trilogy there. Because yeah, it was very character focused, but there was also like 300 characters.
Right.
There's also
Absolutely.
a lot of characters, and there was a lot of world building. And I'm not saying that as a pejorative; I'm just describing it. Right. So I must admit, I read it as kind of a study because I was like, well, I want to see what the big deal is about Joe Abercrombie. I hadn't read him before. I enjoyed it, so hey, there you go. And I made some notes on his style and that kind of thing. But in terms of the SNS and the epic fantasy, I think Joe Abercrombie is a guy who totally gets SNS, and there's very obvious influences in certain characters of his. He has kind of a woman, African Mouser, in one of his short story, Short Sharp Hands, that anthology.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in his breakout trilogy there, he was basically responding to epic fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
Even if sort of Logan Nine Fingers is arguably a very SNS barbarian type guy. The way the whole thing felt, it just really came across to me more like that. And is it a different thing? Or is it just a matter of scale? I think it is a fundamentally different thing because Elric Melniboné, Michael Moorcock's character, who we were so lucky to have a brand new Elric story from him in issue number 1, he frequently encounters things that feel epic in scale, right? Moorcock is known for, at least in terms of genre fiction, coining the idea of the multiverse long before we started seeing it in big Marvel movies and stuff. Right. And that's pretty big, and the whole, fundamental conflicts of law and chaos that, come to a real head in the book Stormbringer, which I would argue is in some ways definitely more epic fantasy than SNS. But that's fine. But even so, it's like somebody was just asking me the other day, what's my favorite Elric story? And this will maybe shift and change over time, but for me, it's the first third of Sailor on the Sea of Fate, which
Mm-hmm.
spoiler for a 50-year-old story or more, whatever it is now. Elric kind of wakes up. He's after sleeping, and it's kind of like, what? Where am I? And everything's foggy, and a boat picks him up. And swiftly, he's recruited with three other guys from other universes that he feels a weird kinship for. He doesn't realize, they're all kind of part of the same person, replicated across many
Right.
universes, and end up being shanghaied essentially into saving the whole galaxy from two ancient, possibly ancient wizard things, and just it's absolutely bonkers the scale of it.
Right.
But the perspective of it is so locked on Elric and a few other guys who are just like, we're remarkable, but we're just people. This is beyond us. And, people's sanity just starts melting over the course of it. By the end, even for the sort of more durable, heroes, as opposed to their minions that they get, Elric and the other three guys, they're all kind of like, I hope I forget this or think it was a dream because this is just too much for me, man. And then it
Right.
kind of moves on. And the idea is it's just this weird episode in his life. It's not and the saving the universe was fun and all, but it was really to get ideas about like fate and free will, and it's to explore themes. It wasn't, and there was never a feeling that the universe was going to end, and it wasn't like your sort of classic Marvel thing where like there's a huge glowy explodey in the sky, and if you're saving the world constantly, like it gets a bit who cares, right? And
Right.
SNS, even when like sometimes it gets to that scale, it tends to focus way more on the sort of personal. Well, here's Brian Murphy's book. One of the things in that personal and mercenary motivations of the individual character. It's really not about the world being saved because it's kind of like, well, that's a backdrop to exploring this person and maybe their reasons for getting caught up in it. They're probably not actually trying to save the world, or if they are, it's because they're either forced to or because it serves purposes that are relate more to them. And that story is just trying to survive, man.
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
so 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 to, I think Epic is its own thing. I think there's definitely like slivers of overlap. You can't avoid it in the various fantasy genres. But I do think it tends to be more groups of people, as Alec might wind up being really group of people in that story, than one or two individuals. And I do think it tends to be more heroic motivations, even if the characters are bastards. Like I mean, an Abercrombie story, like yeah, fundamentally Logan Nine Fingers is not a great dude by any stretch of the imagination, but he
Right.
does tend to be trying to do heroic things ultimately over the course of the story, and some of the characters do too. So I just kind of feel like, yeah, it's Epic's its own thing. Epic's its own thing, but with of course some overlap that's unavoidable.
You mentioned Michael Moorcock, and we'll get to him in a second, but I, really great exploration between the difference between epic and sword and sorcery. How do you feel about sword and sorcery and grimdark then? Because grimdark, I think, really has kind of a, a lot of people, I think, kind of oscillate sometimes between saying this is I'm presenting grimdark fantasy or I'm presenting sword and sorcery. And sometimes I've seen it together, like this is grimdark sword and sorcery. Uh, you know, arguably, Grimdark's kind of helped get started with Glenn Cook's The Black Company, which, I think some people would also argue is sword and sorcery. Some people would also argue is its own different thing. Where do you think sword and sorcery and Grimdark meet each other or don't meet each other?
I think that's a tricky one because yeah, I've heard people say all the things you just described. I've also heard people say, well, Grimdark is the child of sword and sorcery. It's what came next.
I've heard that as well.
Um,
Yes.
and I mean, certainly in terms of like linear time, yeah, it definitely came after SNS was pretty established and had basically just was winding down its second wave. In terms of also where is it born? I mean, a lot of people do say Black Company, but you talk to most contemporary readers and they would tend to say, well, Joe Abercrombie literally is Lord Grimdark on
Right.
Twitter, right?
Right.
So some people would say it was born more recently. Other people would say, well, George R. R. Martin, and I guess this comes back
Yeah.
to the, my metaphor of talking about subgenres as being like ice cream flavors, and you can kind of sometimes you have Neapolitan, man. Sometimes you have two scoops of two different flavors, and it's the same cone. So that can make it hard to draw definitive lines, like scientific, definitions of things. Um, I think I think fundamentally that vitality and that sort of overall feeling of wonderment at the size and wildness of life and seizing life by the horns and all
Right.
that good stuff. That's very SNS. That is not generally in Grimdark. Grimdark to me, it's the main and easiest difference to look at. I mean, some of it can be very funny, and some of it can have very light scenes. Again, Joe Abercrombie. Sorry, I keep coming back to him, but
Right.
he's just like the obvious guy. Um, it's not always just like everything is shitty and everything is bad, but fundamentally, underneath that humor and stuff, at least in the Abercrombie I've read, there's an attitude of, well, the world is ruled by the worst people imaginable, and they'll do the worst things to make things happen, and if you survive, that's a victory. Whereas sword and sorcery wouldn't take that attitude by and large, in my opinion. It would be like, okay, well, yeah, there's some evil, but if you maybe you can triumph over it or at least survive it and live to have another day, have a good time with your buddy, your Fafnir Grey Mouse or Langmar, or and even if you're kind of a more doomed character like Elric, there's still this sense of like the world being a bigger, wilder, awe-inspiring place. It's not just a bunch of poo, which
Right.
you do run into in Graveyard. And yeah, I think that would probably be it for me. Is the vitality and sense of wonderment, and that's a big part of what draws me back to SNS, because it doesn't feel saccharine or utopian by any stretch of the imagination, but it feels like a broader spectrum of emotion and reaction to the world, and certainly that positive side of not saying everything's great, but everything could be amazing. Even if you're a doomed guy like Elric, or basically a supervillain like Kane, Carnivora
Right.
Wagner's Kane. If anybody doesn't know the names I'm mentioning, by all means, please look them up. They're amazing. Um, yeah. There's just a positivity to it. There's just a positivity to it. SNS is just so different. Yeah.
Fantastic. So you already touched on him, but he's considered a cornerstone of sword and sorcery, and I would argue a cornerstone of fantasy in general. You were able to nab a new Elric story by Michael Moorcock, The Folk of the Forest, which appears in New EDGE Sword and Sorcery #1. Can you tell us about how this came to be? And maybe, I can only speak for myself, but I can also probably speak for some other listeners out there. Um, it's always a dream. You always want to meet your idols and your influences, and just be able to have some sort of communication with them. What was it like? What can you tell us about working with Michael Moorcock, and of course, the Folk of the Forest, his new Elric story?
Well, people often say like, "Well, never meet your heroes." Yeah, sometimes meet your heroes.
Yeah,
Sometimes meet your heroes.
absolutely.
Yeah, no, Michael, who I'm gonna probably just call Mike, which sounds just vaguely disrespectful, but it's how he signs everything. It's how he signed everything since I found an essay of his from '61. It just said Mike. So
Yeah.
I'm probably going to call him Mike, and I don't want to sound like I'm doing that thing where like, oh, you interact with a celebrity once, and you're like, I'm really familiar and close with them.
No, that's
but yeah, like
awesome. Yeah.
Mike is
Mike.
as
Yeah.
sweet and wonderful as you would hope. He was everything you would hope for in
It's
getting to know him a little
fantastic.
bit better. And it was a delight eventually in our email and correspondences where we were like talking about the cats we liked. And I shared a cat photo with my Moorcock. Like, I shared a picture of my Siamese. Like, it's just ridiculous. And he's got a good sense of humor about himself. In another interview, an interview he'd been in just before an email exchange we had, he sort of joked about how he loves meat pies, and I brought
Yeah.
that up and I was like, oh yeah, when I lived in England, blah, we were talking a little bit about food. And he's like, yeah, when I was younger, I used to write books for money to buy drugs. Now I do it to buy meat pies. Like he just had a sense of
That's
humor.
fantastic. Yeah.
So that
Oh,
was great. Very sweet and thoughtful, very good about communicating, very professional, as
yeah.
you would hope for. And that's not always the case with some, older, very established authors, because they'll get to a place where editors can't say no to them and they take advantage of it. Not so with Mike. He is an absolute gentleman and a professional author. And as a very fun guy to chat with and stuff. I wish I had like a grand quest of some kind I could tell you that led to me getting in touch with him, but it was luck and daring and then luck again. I was lucky
Right.
in that someone I knew, and I won't say who because I never get bugged them, had his email. I knew
Yeah.
I was doing the project. I said, "Hey, have you thought about asking Michael Moorcock?" And I was like, "Sure." He's like, "Well, actually, here's his email." So, okay, so then I was luck, daring. I dared to ask. Just sort of
Mm-hmm.
said, "Here's my schedule. What do you think?" I don't know. And then I got lucky that he, after some brief scheduling discussion, was like, "Okay, I can do any story for you on that timeline." And the funny thing is, I would have printed his grocery list, right?
Of
I mean, just
course.
getting to say I got a new Michael
Yeah.
Moorcock, like, sure. So I didn't know what I was getting precisely. I gave him I was like, sword sorcery, and it's 4,000 to 6,000 words. That's the window for the stories in the new issues. And he was like, okay. And then over time, I gathered that he, bless him, he's mentioned this in interviews. It's not he's been having sort of hand issues, making typing difficult. And then I saw him in an interview where he said, "Oh, I'm doing a vignette for this new Sword and Sorcery magazine in Canada." And I was like, "Well, that's got to be me." But vignette, oh no, because this was after the Kickstarter where I, of course, heavily advertised with Michael Moorcock, who wouldn't do that. And I was like, "Oh no, are we only going to get like 1,000 words, or the backers going to like hate me because I didn't give them as much as they were looking for." And then eventually, around like a few months went by, and he's like, "Okay, I've got a almost complete draft. It's almost 4,000 words. I'll probably be up four grand when it's done." And I was like, "Okay, great, awesome. It meets my minimum. Perfect. I feel better now." Um, and then he's like, "By the way, it's going to be Elric." And I was finding this out in like June. We funded in February, so I just was like, "Oh, it's going to be what? Okay, great." Like, and then he sent he was like, "I'm flying to well, I won't say where he is, but he's like, I'm flying out of the country just in case the plane doesn't land right. Here's my incomplete draft, so you have something." And I was like, "Okay." I got the incomplete draft. I amazingly held off on reading it, but my staff were like, "Please let us read it." So I was like, "Okay, you guys can read it. Just let me know if you think it's good, but don't tell me anything else because I want to have a perfect read when I get the complete draft." And they were all like, "Oh, it's great. Just needs an ending." I was like, "Okay, cool." Few weeks go by, and then he says, "Okay, I'm gonna do a page one rewrite." And I was like, "You're gonna what?" And then a week later, he's like, "Okay, here's the story. It's now 8,000 words." And I was like, "Holy crap!" Okay, and I had a complete story, and of course, like, yeah, I'll take the extra 2,000 words. It's Michael Moorcock. Like most authors, I would have kicked it back and been like, but it's And so
it's Michael
I
Moorcock.
Like, I printed it out, took it to the pub, sat down on a nice sunny day with my beer, and just read brand new Elric story. And I was the first one to read the complete version anyway. And it just felt amazing because I had spent, these past years, as I mentioned, like studying and exhaustively reading the genre. And I didn't just read, Elric and other Moorcock stuff because he's the guy you got to read. I read it because I was enjoying it, but also because he's so fundamental. I feel like there's sort of three major patron saints of a sword and sorcery. And it's obviously Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber with Fafhrigger Mouser, and Michael Moorcock. And now I don't want to diminish C.L. Moore or Charles Saunders or other important authors, but those three guys were, in terms of just like the recognition they get, certainly and the impact they've had on SNS specifically are just the biggies. And as you mentioned quite correctly, Michael Moorcock has had a huge influence on other people. Absolutely, Neil Gaiman and George R. R. Martin immediately come to mind as being completely unapologetic about, lifting things and boring things, whatever, being in touch with Michael later when they got famous enough, I guess, to do so or whatever. He's a huge influence on a lot of things. And once you read him, you'll be like, "Oh my God, I can't believe like all these references and ripple effects and across, books, movies, TV. I mean, House of Dragons, right? Like Matt Smith is basically visually anyway, Elric.
Absolutely.
And you get these sort of responses to building off of Elric, like R.A. Salvatore's visit there, at least began as such. Anyway, and other characters he's done. I mean, he's done so much more than Elric, but he's very prolific. But then there I am reading the story and just like, vibrating. And I read it. And of course, you kind of worry, right? You're like, what if after all this buildup, I mean, some people don't like some of his later stories. Man, I don't know. And it was everything I'd hoped for. And it has an ending that surprised me and I found very touching, actually. And that's all I want to say. I don't want to give it away, other than I guess I'll mention also it is a younger Elric tale. Elric is a teenager and he's still living on the Melibene, and it's a different point in his life than maybe like a lot of the other stories that come later. But I think it's really remarkable that he has been writing that character for over 60 years. And not only was he so generous as to share him with me and to weave our magazine into that great literary history. I've had his biographers been in touch with me saying, "Hey, can we get copies of that to sell for our store? Because, you're now part of the whole shebang that we're recording, right?" I mean, that felt like I was like, "Oh yeah, of course he has a biographer." That email surprised me. Be woven into that and to have the story. And he's been writing this guy for so long. He's written so much of Elric. And to still find new things to do with him and new things to say with him, and to flesh out, key side characters, and to write it all in a way that if this is someone's very first ever Elric story, if you're listening to this interview and you're like, "Sounds cool, but I've never heard of, Moorcock or Elric or any of this stuff. Why should I care?" Trust me, when I say this story works excellently as an introduction to the character.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a thing where you have to, like, oh, do I have to have read the last 30 years of continuity? No, no, it works very well as an introduction. And as something else I love so much about SNS in general, right? Because it tends to be episodic tales and because it has that history rooted in the pulp magazines where you didn't know what was going to be someone's first story. So you always had to at least have a brief mini intro to the guy, or woman or whoever it is in the first pages, let's say. There's a history of making these things really accessible to new readers. And that is, I think, a real strength of SNS that will help carry it forward, whether it is someone discovering Elric for the first time through this tale, or somebody checking out a story by a brand new author like June Orchid Parker's story in issue 2. I'm particularly fond of. I mean, I like everything in there, but it's her very first story. So I just kind of think of her and Mike as like these two ends of this spectrum of experience that we're featuring in these new issues, because it is very important to me, as I say. The history of the classics and loving that and showing that and teaching people why it matters, and bringing forward new people with new voices to do new things that is still recognizable as SNS. So it all swims together. Anyway, Mike's great. He's everything you could want. And I hope, we'll see. I can't say anything, but I hope we get to work with him again.
Yeah. I have to ask, because we spent a little time talking about Conan, but there's recently been a lot of discussion in the last year about Elric, especially since Mike's put out new novels. There's been talk.
Yeah,
for
the Citadel
years.
Forgotten Myths, right? He got that out last year along with the saga, like big hardcovers of the 3 volumes that collect basically all the Elric. Basically, not quite.
The new book's fantastic. What do you think is the appeal and the draw of Elric to modern audiences? Because there really is an upsurge in people who are discovering him now. And it's wonderful that you have the Folk of the Forest in the first issue of New EDGE Sword and Sorcery to really kind of introduce him. But why do you think, and you've used the word vitality often in this interview, and I think it is such a wonderful word to apply to sword and sorcery, but where is the vitality that people can find in Elric? Why do you think people love that character so much? Just your take.
It's funny, because this is common knowledge for people who are already deep into the stuff, but Elric basically came out of an editor asking Michael Moorcock to make up a Conan type, right? When Conan was on his sort of second wave, very beginnings of his second wave upswing, and an editor was like, all right, we gotta get us some of that Conan stuff. And Mike was like, and he just like popped Conan inside out, right? Conan's always, he's a uncivilized barbarian, bronze-skinned, mighty thewed, filled with strength, and all this stuff.
6'4", muscle bound.
Yeah, and he rarely doubts himself, and he's very confident, and he's got this god that doesn't even care about him or anybody, and he likes it that way. And then he by the end of his career he ends up ruling a kingdom, whatever. But fundamentally, he's a loner walking through civilized worlds. Elric is, well, he's not bronze feud, he's albino. It's about as far from bronze skin as you can get. He begins his stories. He does not stay there very long, folks, trust me. But he begins his story as the last in the line of emperors of a decadent nation, Melniboné, which is very clearly in ways a parody of both Tolkien's High Elves and of the British Empire. Like it's, you really got to remember the British thing when you're reading Mike's writing. It informs so much. And so he's like the height of decadence and civilized, and he's weak. He's just physically frail. And before he gets hold of his, famous sword Stormbringer, which has its own issues in terms of keeping him going, he's addicted to drugs. He needs drugs, like mysterious fantasy drugs. It's not like he's snorting coke, but to keep his vitality, to keep moving, and it creates this constant tension in the stories where anytime, it's like, oh, Elric's about to do something, oh no, he's weak now, crap, he's got to like do some drugs, or he's out of drugs, or what does he do? Or then, as I say, later he gets his sword, which feeds him vitality, but comes at a terrible cost, and was, of course, a metaphor for its own kind of addiction, and how we hurt those around us when we suffer from addiction. So okay, if you have this guy, and he doubts the hell out of himself, right? And most of his magic, because he uses magic, right? Conan hates sorcerers and kind of fears them too. Elric is a sorcerer emperor. So you might think, oh, this guy seems to fly in the face of so much of what you think of when you think of sword and sorcery. But again, his sorcery is dark and mysterious and strange, and it comes from all these weird pacts, and so he's frequently in communication. His god, it's more of a demon, whatever, who cares? But anyway,
Right.
Ariok, right, is his patron, his supernatural patron. So, Crom doesn't talk to Conan at all, doesn't talk to anybody. Ariok, every once in a while he's like, oh, please do me a favor, I need you, and he fights for in his name and stuff. So he's, like I say, he's in many ways the inverse of Conan. So if Conan, the progenitor of the whole genre, is so full of vitality, like, Elric seems to be the opposite. So what is the draw to your question? I think with Elric, people can relate to his self-doubt and the fact that as much as he does doubt himself, Elric still fulfills one of those Brian Murphy points of SNS of being a person of action. He has all these doubts. He has this weakness that he has to overcome. These weird addictions, and sometimes the only way to get out of a situation is to draw on something worse than the problem he's trying to deal with in the form of these old demonic pacts that come from his familial line. And his whole being very civilized, like he's questioning that. He's the odd man out in his people who are absolutely evil. I mean, absolutely beyond evil.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the one person on the whole island who's like, is it bad to sleep with your family members and torture people for fun? Like that's the kind of what kicks off him being like, and like
maybe this colonialism thing isn't all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah, are we the baddies? Yeah. And so, and then that's what strikes him off into the world. And amongst other things, is him going off to explore the kingdoms of man to see what their whole deal is. And maybe there's a different, better way of living. And it's not so simple, but there off he goes. So it's like he still is made an outcast very quickly. And of course, so many of us nerds can relate to that. And even you don't have to be a nerd. I mean, anybody's been an outcast or an outsider at some point in their life in some scene. And anybody can relate to doubting themselves. Anybody can relate to pushing forward. Anyway, that's what I love about Elric. He might mope for a minute or a scene, but he's never going to just be like, well, I give up. He still goes for it. He still kind of has that sense of pushing over his own and more internal obstacles as opposed to the Conan, which tends to be more external. And yeah, so I think that's part of it. I think it's also part of the fact that just Elric and the settings that he tends to go through are quite wondrous and enjoyable to walk through with him. And he has his own kind of like philosophizing that can be interesting to listen to. And, yeah. So that's my feeling about Elric. I think we can still connect to a lot of things with him, even though he is on a surface level a lot more fantastic than most SNS protagonists.
Absolutely. Oliver, thank you so much for sitting down to discuss New Edge Sword and Sorcery with me. But I must end on kind of the obvious question. What happens next?
Okay, so for those who are looking at this visually, we've had the soft cover of issue 0 and the hardcover, which I love so much. I love it so much. And what's happening? Well, we're at that dreadful point in the production process where it's out of my hands. The printer is printing and shipping, and it'll get to our fulfillment office hopefully mid-November. And at which point it will immediately begin shipping out to backers and pre-order people, because you can pre-order these issues right now. If you missed the Kickstarter, that's fine. You can still pre-order. Just go to New Edge Sword and Sorcery. There's a big fat link image on the front. You won't miss it.
And we will, of course, put it down here in the video as well.
Thank you very much. But then, so those issues will go out and people can buy them straight from the main website at that point. So what's next? Well, let me just quickly flash, because I do have the final proofs, which aside from not being bound with glue, they are identical to what people will get. So here's issue number 1. The cover has already been revealed by the time this goes up.
Gorgeous.
I like the back. Yeah. We tried reprinting a piece of art from the interior and then having like a record cover, like track listing kind of thing along the bottom.
That's fantastic.
Now. And inside again, it's not bound, but we do rather like the sort of the 3-column thing, and we've got so much of this art. There's Trevor Nguyenwa's piece there for Sarah Macklin's story. Anyway, it's better for us just to
Sarah Macklin's an excellent author, by the way. Excellent author. Sarah Macklin's an excellent author.
Yeah, I really dig her story in this. Cheers, Web. It's like a sword and sorcery, Sherlock and Holmes kind of thing. Sword and soul, I suppose I should say, which is the sort of like subgenre within the subgenre, basically just meaning sword and sorcery rooted in more like African cultures and myths and history rather than, say, Western European. And we've got issue 2, which I'll quickly flash here. Sorry, podcast listeners, don't worry. You can see all these things on our website by the time this happens. So those are immediately next. And then currently we're looking at probably early to mid. We'll see. We're still finalizing the date, but February. I'm hoping to crowdfund issues 3 and 4. We've got some
Okay.
big surprises for that as well, which I'm very excited to reveal, but it's not time to reveal them yet. So I'll just say that's happening, and we're going to have some new big things in there, some new big announcements. Uh, Maybe a different very important character to the history of sword and sorcery will be appearing. Who knows? And they will be a soft and hardcover, and we'll have some really cool like exclusives for the whole thing. I really think we need to do pins. We might. There's a good chance we'll be doing pins because our logo just like is perfect for that. But here's the
Oh,
biggie.
and t-shirts, more t-shirts.
Yeah. Oh, pardon me. I didn't even mention. Well, we currently on the website we do have merchandise. That's true. Shoot. Wow. Yeah. We got t-shirts and hoodies, mugs, and stickers, which is what people seem to really want. So I was like, okay, I'll just do the merch that people are asking for because it's pretty easy with services like Redbubble and other stuff to just like put it on everything. Get
Right.
sword and sorcery birth control. Like what? I just was like, let's stay focused and just make a few things. And actually, the fun thing there is our logo right now is kind of a dark blue and beige. And that is taken from issue zero's cover, and those two colors are lifted straight from the cover art by Gilead. And so the logo will be a different pair of colors on each issue each time, again, drawn from the cover art, right? So that's kind of fun. It's kind of like a blue, black, and orange for issue 2, and kind of like a very faint yellow and maroon for maroon burgundy, whatever, for issue 1. So why am I mentioning all that? Because what I want to do for fun is make the merchandise be kind of limited edition. So
Right.
as soon as issues 1 and 2 become available, issue 0 logo merchandise will vanish, and we'll switch to issue 1 and 2. And then when issue 3 and 4 eventually happen, then that issue 1 and 2 will be gone. So we'll also update the logo across all our socials. Like our whole look will be like, now we're looking like issue 1. So I think that's kind of fun, and I look forward to, if we keep this thing going long enough, people being like, oh, I collected all the pins or all the stickers with the logos. So yeah, so we do have the merchandise too. Pardon me, but here's I'm so excited about issues 3 and 4, and I can't wait to reveal in detail the stuff for those. So as I say, crowdfund around February. We have a newsletter you can sign up for, very low quantity, very high quality. I'm a big believer in just getting people the news they need rather than feeling the need to be like a content mill of every week. So maybe you can find a link to that on our website as well. That's a great way to, because Twitter's collapsing. Who knows what's happening, right? But there's always good old email. So I do recommend signing up for our newsletter so you don't miss these things I'm mentioning down the line. But yeah, crowdfund for this in February probably, and then I'm hoping to expand to publishing books.
Ooh, okay.
And
Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so what I can say right now is that we have 2 books planned for next year. If everything goes well with the magazine funding, because of course if that craps out, oh no, but I'm optimistic.
Of course.
Hopefully next like June, July. Again, this is all being figured out long in advance. So by the time you hear this, I might know more definitively. Again, newsletter. We'll be doing a themed anthology, and it will be kind of taking sword and sorcery and a different kind of genre and seeing what happens when you bring them together. It's going to involve an element of sword and sorcery that we actually kind of touched upon today, that I think I want to see explored a little more. So there's going to be a themed anthology that'll be 6 novelette length stories, so like 12,000 words, or roughly double the longest stories that you'll find in the magazine. And that'll be kind of a very straightforward anthology that if people love it enough, maybe we'll do another volume the following year. And then again, it's all being figured out, but September, maybe, we'll crowdfund a traditionally printed book again. The anthology will probably POD, just keep things simple. But I want to traditionally print something that is a love letter to the book as object, as well as the storytelling itself. I currently call this a Bracken Devil, which is terrible because I just, the publishing company's Bracken Books. My name's Oliver Brakenbury, whatever. I need to come up with a cooler name for it. Maybe I will by later. But for now, it's essentially my riff off of what was called Ace Doubles, right? Ace being a publisher, for those who don't know, 50s, 60s, 70s, and I don't think any further than that, published what they called Ace Doubles, which is kind of what it sounds like, a book that's like 2 short novels, one on either side of the book, right? Each one with its own cover. You just turn the book around and upside down, and because you flip the text right between the 2, and voila, you've got another story by another author. It was a really fun way to usually pair like one big name with one smaller name, and then that would help the smaller name get going, kind of thing. Yeah, so we'll be doing a Bracken Devil, and that will be 2 sword and sorcery novellas, adding up to around 70,000 words. So, short novel length overall. And I want to do that traditionally printed because I really want to do things you can't do with POD, like spray coloring around the edges. So if you've gotten like, books from secondhand bookstores that have that kind of like painted yellow, orange, purple, red, whatever, green in some cases on the edges of the pages, like I want to do that. And if we hit certain stretch goals, we'll put in like a full color art insert in the middle, stuff like that. I really want it to be a beautiful object for people to collect, but also it will be potentially, kicking off a series of novellas, starting with, the two series whose first installments you'll find in that double by those two authors. And that's all I can say for now about that. We'll be pushing that more later. But yeah, so if like I say, if all that goes well, maybe we'll do even more books in 2025 and we'll see what happens. But yeah, next year, more issues of the magazine with new surprises in them, and fingers crossed, publishing an anthology and a Bracken double.
I'm looking forward to all of that, especially the Bracken double. I think, especially when it comes to like mass market paperbacks, there was a real age when like so many publishers did so many things with the mass market paperback that were so creative, and like you said, helped so many people gain awareness of other authors in doing so. I'm really looking forward to that Bracken double. That's a really, really cool project. I hope that comes to fruition. That's really cool.
And actually, you reminded me, I won't go on but I will say I too love the mass market paperback. And as much as we can, I think we can get it pretty close. That's the size we're going to do for the POD anthology, and that's 100% the size we're going to do for the Bracken double. I think the mass market paperback, aside from I have some nostalgia for when they were more common, but I just think it's a perfect size. I'm not a huge not to poo-poo those who feel differently, but I feel like the trade paperback, which for a bunch of business reasons really became prominent, is kind of the worst of both worlds, because it's sort of a little big and ungainly for some people, depending on the size of your hands, like a hardcover. But it's also like vulnerable, like a softcover. Yes. So it just sort of, it doesn't really hit either. I don't know what the positives are for the reader. I know what the business case for them.
It must be a weird phenomenon, because I feel like the smaller market paperbacks are more shelf sturdy than traditional trade paperbacks. They just last such a long time.
Yeah, and they also tend to be, because they're shorter and stouter, they don't, generally speaking, get all floppy and kind of warped.
Right.
If they're not, stored a certain way, the way that trades do, for sure. So for me, it's like I get hardcovers for a few authors. I just got to have the book right now, and otherwise, like, I get trades now because that tends to be what's available. But if someone says, "Hey, I'm selling a mass market paperback," I want to know about it even before I hear what the heck is inside. I'm just curious. I'm like, oh, they're doing that. Cool. All right, what's inside? Who's writing it? I don't know. Who cares?
Absolutely.
So yeah,
Oliver, thank you so much for coming on Pondering the Orb and talking about New EDGE Sword and Sorcery issues number 1 and 2. For everyone watching at home, you can find out more information about those 2 wonderful issues that will be coming out in November. By the time you see this, they will be available, and you can find them in the description below to this video. Oliver, once again, thank you so much. Congratulations on the new publication, and I wish you nothing but success. I would toast to Crom, but Crom doesn't care. So I will just say good luck, my friend, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you once again for joining us for this special episode examining New EDGE Sword and Sorcery Magazine. Please make sure to check out all the links below in the description, and make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more from Pondering the Orb. We'll be back next time to examine issue number 2, but until then, safe journeys.